benefit from what everyone has to say, and so I asked him to come back to the school. And he's already started talking, so you have an idea of what he's like already. Okay, Gonzalez, handing over to you.
Thank you. So let me do a couple things. I'm going to go over this particular presentation that I did a while back. And the reason I'm using it is because it touches on all types of things that I've done. A little bit about me. I always say this. I'm one of those people who has wandered, but I've never been lost. I've been all over the place. So my bachelor's in computer science, my master's in religious studies, my doctorate in management, my PhD in economics. So I've wandered for many years. And with my research, I'm in Cuba, Brazil, Trinidad, Nigeria. So it's been a long path for about 40 years, looking at kind of everything that has to do with the African diaspora, looking at specifically religious traditions, but also the role of women and how these traditions have shaped over time. Today I'm looking at some really interesting things about how dress is being, how diaspora religious folks are using dress as a form of identity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what I've done, also give you a little bit of feel for what it's like in the field, doing research in countries perhaps that don't speak the language and need to adapt. So this presentation was about globalizing spaces, resistance, and renewal, and it really looks at kind of what did the African ancestors do differently? How did they adapt? What were the things that went on during the period of not only from slavery, but right after they were, in quotations, emancipated, freed. This particular painting is from 1851. It's actually also an example of how religious syncretism works. This is the day of the Three Kings Parade in Havana. For those who are Catholic, have a Catholic background, the day of the Three Kings is when supposedly the three magi went to visit Jesus. In Cuba, as in many countries in Latin America, it was a feast day. So it was a day where both free Africans and slaves had a day off. You'll notice that there's wealth of different clothing, masks that are very typical in West Africa, even some that are a bit over the Congo region, kind of showing off what actually happened on the island. And related to that, I like to add this little piece here, because when people talk about Santeria, Voodoo, Candomblé, there's always this conversation of how Orisha, Odu, how did they get mixed up with Catholic images, Catholic saints. There's all types of syncretic conversations going on. But one of the reasons that occurred was that whenever there was a mutual aid society established, the Spanish realm put that mutual aid society under the guardianship or protection of a particular Catholic saint. So this syncretic process was established way early. All of these mutual aid societies were under the auspices and protection of some type of Catholic saint. This happens to be one of them that was dedicated to Saint Barbara. We'll talk about that. For those who do Orisha work, that can be associated with Shango or Oyat, depending on what tradition you're looking at. Along that way, resistance meant many different things. And this is a great example that I love to use, which is the defining of sacred space. One side is Brazil, the other side is Trinidad, but you see many of the same things, dancing in circles, wearing particular colors, having flags, indicators of the different orishas. This is one of the things that I spend a lot of time looking at how did these traditions survive? What did they do to be able to live within the greater society and still practice their own traditions, right? There is a lot of movement today toward returning to Africa, returning to the source, and I think that it's very important to keep a good balance between appreciating what the ancestors did to survive and where new things can come back into play, because there is this constant communication. It's another one of my favorite topics, which is globalization and the speed at which information is shared today. I notice that a lot when I'm in Nigeria. And I will say that Nigeria is not the main part. It's not the easiest place to navigate, and you have to kind of adapt to food, adapt to electricity that goes off at 7 o'clock at night, come back at 7 o'clock in the morning, roads that are very difficult to travel. As soon as I walk into Nigeria, they probably know Igbo. Igbo is a Yoruba word for stranger, but particularly for light-skinned strangers. So I'm a mark. I'm easily identified when I'm there. And I think that when you're doing research, and you gotta think to yourself, kind of reflect on what am I doing when I'm present. If I'm present, I have just changed the religious experience that's going on around me. I've changed the social experience that's going on around me. I cannot extract myself from it, and I have to be aware of it when I'm looking at what's going on. This, I'm going to go really quickly. I'm not going to play this, but I'm going to play something else a little bit later. I think one of the interesting things about all of these traditions is that music played, and continues to play a very important part in what is the African diaspora and what is traditions. This particular movie from 1957 actually has Celia Cruz singing, and she has Celia Cruz singing Orisha songs, and you can see the bata drums from Nigeria, from West Africa, there in the picture playing. This kind of says to you, reinforces how important imagery was in many of these traditions. I'm going to stop here for a second, and I'm going to say, when you're doing research cannot be just focused on one piece. Right? When you're looking at something, you need to look at its historical content. You need to look at its social content. You need to look at its cultural impact, especially in these traditions that do not have a sacred text per se. So when you're looking at this from the perspective of religion, I always say I'm more of a social scientist than someone who might call themselves a theologian or someone who is stronger at studying sacred texts. These traditions are all about the experience. So when you're in the field, you are part of the experience. Any questions? You guys can stop me because I'll just keep on rambling for the whole hour. All right. When you're looking at something, you need to look at its historical content. You need to look at its social content. You need to look at its cultural impact, especially in these traditions that do not have a sacred text per se. So when you're looking at this from the perspective of religion, I always say I'm more of a social scientist than someone who might call themselves a theologian, or someone who is stronger at studying sacred texts. These traditions are all about the experience. So when you're in the field, you are part of the experience. Any questions? You guys can stop me because I'll just keep on rambling for the whole hour. All right. I also want to touch on another aspect of this, which is that when you're looking at the African diaspora, it is intrinsically connected to nationalism and identity in many, many ways. There is both the sense of identity among Afro-Cuban practitioners, Afro-Brazilian practitioners, Afro-Trinidadian practitioners, and there's also an identification among African-American practitioners. And this was first kind of seen when O'Surgeman, Walter Eugene King, went to Cuba and was initiated in the Cuban system. Then in 1972, he went to Nigeria and was initiated in the Nigerian system, and he established the Ojotunji village. So it's important also from a researcher's perspective to, I always kind of say, I'm looking at this, but there's a lot of stuff that hangs from it. And you want to kind of think to yourself, okay, how am I scoping what I'm looking at, right? Because scope creep in research is the downfall of a dissertation, right? A dissertation fails when it wants to be everything, and you want to touch on every single topic that you've worked on or you found, right? You need to focus your research, and like I always say, this is my research, this is the stuff that hangs off of it. These are other areas that I may work on in the future, other pieces that I may work on in the future. Just this one slide could be a dissertation completely by itself. It can look at nationalism, it can look at identity, it can look at participation, it would look at the historical impact, it looks at how travel impacted the situation, how were relationships built during this time period. Just this one slide could be an entire dissertation on the evolution of Ojotunji from its inception to the present. So again, my soundbite to you is focus on where you want to make the impact. One of the great things, and this is my favorite topic to talk about, which is the globalization of Orisha tradition. In 1959, when the Cuban Revolution occurred, there were probably a couple of handful of Orisha practitioners in the United States. Many of them were musicians who had gone to New York. Little research is done on Catherine Dunham and her dance troupe, which actually helped and supported many Afro-Cubans who came to New York. But there was not a global Orisha community. There were individualized Orisha communities in Trinidad, in St. Vince, in Haiti, in Brazil, in Cuba, of course in Nigeria and West Africa. But there was no such thing as a global religion. Over the last 60 years, and with the help of technology, there has come to exist what I consider to be a global Orisha marketplace. And I use the word marketplace because it implies has anyone ever been to a marketplace in like the Caribbean, or even a marketplace in Spain, or a marketplace in Africa, a real marketplace, right? And what happens at a real marketplace? There's a whole bunch of people, there's all these stalls, people are selling stuff, there's bartering going on, there's trading, you go to the stall and you say, oh, how much is that? And she says $10, and you say, no, I'll give you 6. There's all situations that are going on, right, in the marketplace. And the Orisha community is almost kind of like a marketplace these days, because there is a Cuban version, there's a Brazilian version, there's a Haitian version, there's a Trinidadian version, there's numerous versions in West Africa. And how do all of these traditions interact? Well, to me, they interact like in a marketplace. They're all in there together. Everyone is showing off what they do. This is very, very, very common in the last 20 or so years in Nigeria. As you can see, there's the annual Shango Festival. There's always was a Shango Festival, but now it's a global Shango Festival. There was always an Oshun Festival, but now it's a global Oshun Festival. And you see practitioners from all over the globe coming and participating in these, right? So here's another example. You could just talk about these festivals, their religious impact. You could talk about their economic impact. You could talk about how tourism is impacted by this. You can have a conversation about religious tourism related to this. All of the little pieces. So I have been lucky to attend numerous of these festivals. They're crowded. They're dangerous, quite honestly. You need to be careful where you are and how what you're doing. I think that anyone who conducts field work needs to clearly understand where they are to be able to conduct that research, and definitely always have someone who's in country, who understands the dynamics, that's there with you. So global festivals are occurring all over Nigeria. Not only Nigeria, there's the Ando Yamaya Festival in Brazil that brings people from all over the globe that are there. They're now doing festivals in Trinidad. So this is a religious tradition that is becoming global in a very interesting and dispersed way. So I love this. I always have to focus on this. As everyone can see, I'm very light. So when I'm in West Africa, everyone can clearly spot me a mile away. But part of this is about marketing and understanding that all of these traditions have an economic impact. And note that I specifically took these 2 pictures from Facebook because they focus on highlighting non-West Africans in ceremony. Okay? And why is that? There's the economic aspect of that. There's this concept of globalizing religion here. Okay? Anyone can practice this. It's clear that's the case, right? It also shows that it's welcoming, the smiles, the offerings, right? This in itself, we could probably spend all day today talking just about this picture, just about these 2 pictures, and what are they saying to people that are looking at these images in Facebook? Right? So these are mine. On your left is I'm at the Gelede Festival of a small town in West Nigeria called Yaro. Also dressed in white is a very good friend of mine, Solomon, who is a practitioner of all type. All of these masks here belong to either me or Solomon. I've gone through all types of ceremonial preparation for these masks to dance for me. The Gelede society dances. What's interesting is that the masks tend to be feminine, the way that they're portrayed, but who dances them are men. It is one of the many dance and mask cults in Nigeria that look to provide balance, look to provide prosperity for the town. the Gelede dances in the annual festival of the town. They dance through the streets. People offer them money. People offer them gifts. They visit the different homes, and they bring together both an aspect of kind of festival happiness, but also an issue for balance. They're accompanied by drums. Children tend to walk with them, receive gifts and candies from them. So I spend a lot of time in Ilaro and Abdabuga with the Gelede Society because it has an association with Yamaya, which is an Orisha that's very important in the Afro-Cuban tradition, and Odua. To the right was one of my 3 trips to see the Oni of Ife. He's considered the paramount traditional ruler of the Yoruba, and we spent a couple weeks. I spent a week with him the first time, and then 2 other times I've been there with them, visiting and participating in the annual events and ceremonies that are there. They start off the year with the Hatala ceremony, and that takes about 16, 18 days. That's another thing. All of these festivals are weeks and weeks long. So if you're out there doing research, you need to think to yourself, I'm going to be here 3 weeks, 4 weeks for these type of ceremonies. Sometimes you can just go for a day or 2 into different towns, but a lot of times it requires staying in a town for several days. So just like there's been global renewal, there is now renewal going on in Cuba, and Cuba's been in the news pretty much lately. No oil from Venezuela, all types of social issues going on in Cuba. Up until about 1961, Cuba had the annual procession of the Virgins in the coastal town of Reglas. The black and white on the right is the last time that festival was had. The color picture is that was from 2019 or 2020 when I was in Regla, and they were taking the Virgins out across the street. This is very typical. You would see these festivals. You see them in Spain. You'll see them in Italy. You see them all through Latin America, the Philippines, when they either take the Virgin Mary or a particular saint or perhaps Jesus during Holy Week, and they have a kind of carrying the images through the town. In this case, they are accompanied with West African drums and West African chants. So it's a very interesting mix of Catholicism and Orisha at the same time. For those that look to think about the political lens of some of these, as an example, the festivals basically stopped in 1961 when the Cuban government declared that photography that he took during that event. Any questions? Comments? I'm doing all the talking here. That's not fair. All right, I'm gonna keep on going. So, on your right, it's an event in Trinidad. On your left, it's an event in Matanzas, Cuba. The folks in Matanzas are folks, people I know, people I work with. The Yamaya event in Trinidad was because of someone I know there also. The interesting thing about this here is that everyone in Matanzas are actually Americans, but they're in Cuba during the religious events. They could have done them in the United States, but they returned to Cuba. In Trinidad, there's been a very big push to reconnect with Africa. So you will see that they tend to put their faces, the jars, things that are more African or West African-like. And that in itself is a very loaded and packed comment, because when you're talking about visuals, everyone uses jars, but how does that jar actually identify itself as West African? She's carrying it on her head. That's a very West African type of thing. You won't normally see that in Cuba or in Brazil. Yes, Kevin. And you're on mute.
You're working with that. So I have a question. You just mentioned that in Trinidad recently there's been a push to sort of reconnect with Africa. I find that fascinating because you know that one of the things that's happening in America with sort of foundation of Black Americans is the opposite of that. And so I'm just curious if you've done any kind of research or understanding of what's driving that push in Trinidad.
Well, I think Trinidad's doing the same thing that the early African American communities here were. They were going back to Nigeria, looking for their roots. There's a very large desire to return home to see what home was like. So they do that not only with ceremonies, but both in Trinidad and in Brazil, well, and in Cuba, and here in the United States. There's been a very large community of people who have gone and have opted to initiate in Nigeria instead of initiating here in the United States or in Trinidad, and bringing those initiations back. So we might argue that there's a social aspect to this, an aspect of identity, an aspect of reconnecting. I think that many of especially the early African Americans who got involved with Orisha in the United States were looking for some type of connection to their roots. Today there's many people who practice Orisha. I have Orisha friends in California. They're from the Philippines. They're from Mexico. They're from Germany. They're all over the place. But there was a very big push to look at identity. And if you think about early on in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, there was a whole movement to go back to Sierra Leone, and there were African Americans who actually went back to Africa and adapted. Now, interestingly enough, Cuba had very little contact with Africa outside of the slave trade, okay? Outside of kind of one way. Right? Brazil, on the other hand, they kept a constant flow back and forth between Nigeria and Salvador in Bahia. So a lot of people don't know, but there's a whole, I guess it's like a segment of Lagos. There's a whole area that was when you get there, you'll see, sorry, let me compose my thoughts. When you get there, you'll see that the architecture there is different. And why? Because there were a large Portuguese influence that went to Nigeria, went to Brazil, came back to Nigeria. There were many, many more Afro-Brazilians who went back to Nigeria and stayed in Nigeria. So sometimes even when you meet Nigerians on the street, their last names are Portuguese. And you're like, where did this last name come from? This last name came from because their grandparents or their great-grandparents were Portuguese merchants who went back and forth. So depending on where the tradition was established, there was different levels of interaction back and forth between the different countries. The United States didn't have that back and forth, correct? It was also an issue of slavery coming in and not going back, right? I mean, there are some examples of slaves across probably all of Central America and South America. There are a few examples. I can't think of them right off the bat, but I've got some of these interested, of Africans who returned to Nigeria. Right? Also keep in mind that during this period, by the time, so the last two countries to abolish slavery were Cuba and Brazil. It is not coincidence that those are the two countries that have the largest Odisha communities in this part of the hemisphere. Why? Because they were still receiving West Africans all the way up until the 1860s, okay? 1886 and 1888. So there's a tremendous amount of movement to those particular two countries, which allowed for slavery and for Odisha to flourish in those two countries. Sharon, you got a question?
Yes. What's my hand now? Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. Does everyone know what Dr. Gonzalez is referring to when he says Orisha? Everyone does? Okay. Yeah, I know you do this. Sonia? Okay, well, Sonia? Yes. Yes. Oh, okay. I was just checking. Okay, making sure. Okay.
So in the diaspora, you'll see Orisha, you'll see Voodoo, because also keep in mind that the movement from West Africa brought people from very diverse, similar but yet diverse communities all over West Africa, from Dahomey, from the Oyo Empire, from the areas of Lagos. So all of these, this movement created all the different versions of Orisha traditions that we see today. So one of the things I'm working on in relation to that is how clothing is used in a couple of ways, and one of those is as kind of like a social identifier, a marker. Right? Back anyone who's doing research back in the 1960s, there was the dashikis that were very popular during that period, and people used to wear the dashikis as kind of like an affirmation of Cuban black identity. Right? So today we're starting to see the same thing. We're seeing a renewed interest in African cloth, adire, ashookwe, wax prints used by not only by the practitioners in terms of clothes, but also in their religious ceremonies and their religious shrines. I think it's very important to note that the different traditions have different ways of defining sacred space. So for those of you who are kind of more focused on a religious point of view, we're looking at things from that sphere. Sacred space, if you ask someone what is sacred space, I think many people will say, well, when I go to church, that's a sacred space, or when I go to synagogue, or when I go to temple, or or when I go to a mosque. Most people identify those as being sacred spaces. In an Odisha worldview, sacred spaces are everywhere. Rivers are sacred spaces, mountains are sacred spaces. Nature in all of its manifestations is part of the sacredness or the sanctity that the divine creates on the earth. So sacred space is very different when you're in Odisha world, like in Odisha time, versus what most people consider the sacred space of a building. So in all of these traditions, sacred spaces are created for events. And part of that creation implies things like cloth, implies things like herbs. It can, and I don't have a picture. Next time I'm going to put one. Oh, I might have one at a shrine where sacred space is put together. So the use of these more recent African material is in some ways a marker of black identity, a marker of Africanness, and at the same time a marker of Odisha. You will see that today there's a particular way that Nigerian women use their head wraps, the gele. That is an indicator of status by the quality of the material. It's adornment that is also coming towards the diaspora. So the diaspora is kind of identifying with these things and building. Here's another one. I'm working on this one right now. That could be a dissertation almost in and of itself. What type of materials are used? Why are they used? How are they used? Notice that during all the conversations I'm having today, I stop and I tell you, look, this is a great dissertation topic. Look, this is enough to make something happen. Each of these little pieces, sounds like a little module. It's only one slide, but it could actually be an entire dissertation, because you have to look at everything from what were Afro-Cubans given to wear when they were slaves versus when they became free versus what they incorporated in Odisha versus what they do today. Right? Just think about just the evolution of cloth. You might compare it to think about the evolution of ties and how ties have evolved for the last few hundred years, right? Kind of the same thing. And here's some interesting. I just wanted you to see what that looks like. Ashoke is extremely popular, and actually you can go out there and there's websites where you can order your entire outfit, choose the material, they make it for you. The adire, which is the blue cloth, that is done with indigo dye, and that is traditional Yoruba. The Yoruba were famous for their blue indigo dyed cloth, which was an indicator of who they were. And actually, during the colonial period, it was imported all over the place, actually, and it was used it actually got all the way to the Philippines. This type of cloth. Here's some more wax print. Does anybody know where the majority of wax print cloth is made? Does any of you know what wax print is outside of now that I just showed it to you? Okay, so if you look, this is very, very typical. And actually here in Miami, they sell it in downtown. In New York, you'll find half a dozen stores that sell wax print. In LA, very typical cloth. It is the type of material that, in the towns that I go to visit, is what most people wear. In Nigeria, you will see a significant difference when you are in the small rural towns. So there are no Macy's or Marshalls or TJ Maxx or Burlingtons in most of the towns in Nigeria. Okay? So a few big stores in Lagos and Abeokuta, but they are kind of the exception. When you're in the smaller towns, you buy material and you go to the seamstress or to the tailor, and he measures you and makes your cloth. A while back when you saw me in that picture I was all dressed in white, that was made in Ilaro for me. So this type of material actually was made for many years in Europe and was imported into Nigeria and all of West Africa. Now there are Nigerian companies that are making this material. Just to give you kind of an idea, so you can buy enough cloth to make an outfit, but I mean by an outfit is a pair of pants and a shirt, for probably about $8. And you pay the seamstress and the tailor another $8. So for about $20, you've got a wardrobe that you're going to use for an event. If you go out there on Facebook and look at some of the annual festivals, you will find that as an example, and I'm going to use the Gallaudet Society. When the Gallaudet Society does their annual festival, they buy hundreds of yards of the same material, and everybody who has a title in the Gallaudet Society dresses with the same wax cloth. So it's also an indicator of status. It's used as a symbol of belonging, and of course, it is also used as a form of entry. So let me unpack that a little bit, because we still got some time. So when you're out in the field doing research, you also have to understand the social context under which you go. So let me give you my example. In Yoruba land, I want to go to a shrine, and every shrine has a community of elders that are in charge of that shrine. It is seen as inappropriate for you to go to the shrine without providing the shrine with some gift. So you walk into the shrine, and you usually provide something that is for the shrine. Very typical here is cloth. So when I go to Nigeria, I order 100 pieces of cloth. They're usually 5-yard pieces. And when I visit a shrine, I always offer cloth to the elders of that shrine. It is understood that you're not buying their time, but rather you're acknowledging their importance. So it's a very difficult thing for a researcher to get by, because you have to have some type of ethical behavior, which is your research comes into question if you're buying the knowledge, correct? If you're buying what is going on. So therefore, are what you're learning valuable, or is it being sold to you? And if it's being sold to you, is it accurate? So this is a very, very, very complex part of research. But at the same time, you have to understand the social context in which you find yourself, right? So when I'm in West Africa, I bring what I consider to be the traditional offerings to a shrine: cloth, my time, ebo, which is palm oil, those things that would be things that would be used in divination. Many times in West Africa, especially in Nigeria, in the smaller towns, if you go to a shrine, the elder of that shrine may not even talk to you until they cast obi. Obi is a form of divination, and they ask the Orisha, the deity of that shrine, if they even are allowed to talk to you. So sometimes you arrive at a shrine and you bring your obi or stuff like that for them, just to give obi to the deity in charge of the shrine, okay? To see if your presence there is even allowed. Okay? I have been to places where they have been, no, this deity does not want to talk to you, and we've had to pick up and leave. That's all there is to it. There's been other places where we have been welcome, and through divination they've allowed us to stay and to talk and to visit with them. There's been places where we have established a friendship with the people, right? When I take pictures with them, I always remind them, I'm going to use this in my research. Are you comfortable with that? This is also something that's really important. In the West, we try, when you're putting together your IRB, if you're going to have a release, if you're going to use someone's picture, if you're going to use information from them, you need to be able to ensure that you're following the appropriate research protocols. In many of these countries, some of the people that I work with actually speak Yoruba, but they speak very little English. Some of them don't even write Yoruba. They only speak it. So sometimes when I have these conversations, I always ask for verbal confirmation. Are you comfortable with me doing this? Can I take a picture of this for my research? Can I take a picture of this shrine for an article I'm working on? So, most of the things that I do are, from the IRB perspective, considered public. Okay? Because again, I participate in events that are open to the public. They're street fairs, they're open ceremonies. So therefore, the information you get there, the pictures you get there, have less of a restriction from an IRB perspective, because these are public events. But nonetheless, even when I am in close proximity of more private events, I'll ask permission. I also will tell you that when you're doing anything that has to do with religion, you need to understand when is the time not to take that picture. Right? It's not when to take the picture; it's when not to take the picture, because you need to also respect the boundaries of sacred space. So I'm gonna tell you all a little story. Years ago, I know literature very well, and I went to a book by called Kelete, and in that picture, Kelete had a picture of a priestess with a particular caption that caught my eye, because it referred to Odua, and that's a Cuban Orisha, and I wanted to visit this particular town. But we knew nobody in that town. So my friend and I got in our car and we drove out there. I had a picture in my hand that I made a copy of in the book, and I arrived at the open market of this town. And we started to ask people, does anybody know these people? This was a picture from 1972. So you can imagine that was over 50 years ago. And somebody sitting there said, oh yeah, wait, his son is still alive. Let me call him. And that's how I met Abel Avilaro, from a picture, okay? From a photograph of his father in a moment of ceremony, right? So even a photograph that you take can have a life of its own 30 or 40 years from now. So you need to also think about the impact of what you're producing and how you're producing it. And I'm always very cautious of what I provide and how I provide it. And it's a perfect segue to this. Okande-kun, which is the person who owns this shrine that you're seeing there, she is an Afro-Cuban priestess, but she's also very connected with Nigeria. So in this image here, there are Cuban things, and there's African things, Nigerian things, and Lukumi things. Okay? If you see that there's a crown with a bunch of birds, that is a Yoruba crown. She has it on top of her patala. But this necklace of beads that you see, if you can see it, I hope, with little red dots, that's an Afro-Cuban creation. Okay? So this is another area of tremendous research and conversation that I personally have spent a lot of time on. You know, I talk about globalizing images, globalizing products. Here, we're starting to see integration and globalization in terms of shrines, in terms of how people venerate, how people understand their religious tradition, or how they want to understand their religious tradition. So this could be a whole other chapter of somebody's book. How do these images work together? How do people understand this integration of all these images? Is it just visual aspect? Is there rooted religious thinking associated with all of this? Right? Don't be shy. Think of all of the different possibilities. Someone may look at you and they might say, "Oh, wow, I never thought of that before." Right? It's important. It's important. On the other side is an image of Aya Shaluga, done by a artist here in the United States. Aya Shaluga is the Odisha of money, and for me, she is the symbol of the globalization of the Odisha marketplace, because the market, money, the exchange, it's a fundamental driver, and it's not only a fundamental driver here in Odisha, but we could argue it's a fundamental driver in all religious traditions. I grew up as a Roman Catholic, and every Sunday we would put a little envelope with our economic gift to the church in a little basket, right? How many people don't see preachers on TV that ask for you to send money, or they're going to pray for you, right? So no matter what aspect of religion, it is always connected with money, in my opinion. Maybe I'm a bit of a cynic here in this aspect, but so that's why to me, Aya Shaluga is the personification of globalization in the Odisha tradition. Right? I'm going to skip that. So I'm going to play one of these, and the only reason I'm going to play one of these is because I find it incredibly fascinating that Odisha has spread across the globe in a way that you could not imagine, and because music, music seems to be the subject of conversation since the Super Bowl yesterday. So this works right into this idea of music is this great equalizer. Well, to me, it's a very interesting equalizer even among Odisha, because there are musical Odisha events happening everywhere. This is a show in London, and this was an event in Tokyo, and you kind of look at it, and I kind of marvel at how music. Here's another whole topic for someone. Music, how music has become the gateway to Odisha. Many people came to Odisha through music because they wanted to learn to play bada, or they wanted to learn to sing, or so it's an incredible equalizer. Let me see if I can do this without causing all types of craziness here. I know that I have to do. Wait a minute. I know I have to do something.
For the song?
Yes, but wait, because the other day, here, share. I practiced because I needed to figure out how the heck this worked, so I had to do it.
Yeah, I think you have to tell it.
Can you hear it? So just a little piece, but what's interesting about that is this is in Tokyo. It's not in Cuba. It's not in the United States. It's in Tokyo, right? And I'm going to take advantage of playing this one. This is the Oshun Festival. So there she is. That right there, this here, they're very kind of an interesting imagery on a horse, which I think is kind of odd. To me, it's odd that he's on his horse. So one last thing I do want to touch upon is the case where, as these traditions expand, now there are competing ceremonies. So this particular ceremony that you're seeing here is a lighting of 16 oil lamps. It is part of the Oshun annual festival. But the Odisha folks in Trinidad, who could not go to Osogbo in Nigeria, have decided to create their own reenactment of the ceremony in Trinidad. So this is also a very interesting aspect of research, which is are these competing? Are they complementing? Is there validity in attending the Trinidadian ceremony, just like there would be validity in attending the ceremony in Osogbo, Nigeria? Does this create conflict between these communities? Could this be seen as complementary? I only have questions. I don't have any answers here for that one. But that kind of gives you an idea of, all right, so I think I have finished my part of the chat. I'm way open to any questions, comments, or otherwise from the group. It'd be my pleasure.
Hi, my name is Desiree. I just wanted to quickly say that I really appreciate this. My master's focus is on Orishas and Syncretism and Synthetia, so it was very interesting to learn this and some other parts that I haven't been too familiar with just because of the nicheness of some of my focuses. So it's extremely awesome to be able to have you on the call today.
Excellent. So Desiree, if you're really focused on syncretism, you may want to look at some of the things that happen with the mutual aid societies, again, because they were put under the patronage of some particular Orisha and some particular saint. Also keep in mind that when you talk about syncretism, there's also a conversation about, is it ceremonial syncretism or is it complementary syncretism? And I'm going to give you an example so that you understand what I mean. So in West Africa, it's very typical to have a naming ceremony for your child. It's a very typical thing. It's probably typical across most of West Africa. It's very typical among the Yoruba. But when the West Africans got to the New World, they substituted baptism for the naming ceremony. And they did that probably because it was easier. They had to go to church anyway because they didn't have a choice. And they ended up, with the passage of time, accepting that as a valid way of having a naming ceremony. So West Africans have a naming ceremony. Well, traditional Lukumi Santeria people were baptized. Right? The other part that is worth always keeping in the back of your mind is that, and I have this in my dissertation. When I have been in Cuba and I've talked to Afro-Cubans about Nigeria, they all say, "Oh yeah, we come from there, but I'm Cuban." Right? They understand their history, but their cultural framework is Cuba. So Santeria has a cultural framework of going to church on Sundays, has a cultural framework of going to the Festival of Our Lady of Mercy. That was the cultural framework in which they kind of grew up, and that also plays a very big role in how they saw the syncretic process of the Catholic images with their orishas. Still today, if you were to go to Cuba to do research, and it was the 4th of December, which is the festival dedicated to St. Barbara, in like a town like Matanzas, you would see that there were 20 or 30 Afro-Cuban drums playing in town. And they're all playing to Shango, but on St. Barbara's Day, because that was the day that they associate with Shango, so everybody would play to Shango that day, right? So, in some ways, and here I'm going to give you a little tidbit, in some ways, some of this also may have been, because no one asked the ancestors when they did this, back in the 19th century, unfortunately. There was no research, social science researchers till today doing this. Some of this may have replaced the town festivals that would normally have been the case in their hometowns. So every town in Nigeria has an annual festival dedicated to the founders, to the orishas that participate in that town. Sometimes when you're in Nigeria, they'll say, "Oh, this is our culture." They won't call it religion, because a lot of times to them religion means I'm going to the church, the temple, or the mosque. Okay? But they will say, "Oh, this is part of our culture." So that culture, when it got to Cuba and other places, they substituted the Festival of Our Lady of Charity for the town festival that they would have done back home.
Right.
There's the syncretism or the similarities are more than just the icon of the African Orisha with the Catholic image. It also is cultural in terms of what did the community do in terms of coming together for a festival or something like that. So that's just another tidbit for you to think about.
Yes, thank you. It was very helpful and food for thought. I'll kind of dive deeper.
Any other questions? Comments?
Sangria has her hand up.
Oh, talk to me.
I have a question. So right now I'm reading this book called The Color of Compromise: The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, and it kind of goes into like the church and how like it divulged into all the different denominations and stuff in America, and then both sides of it. I know it says complicity in the title, but it talks about both sides of like the church when it defended racism, and then also when it went against it, abolition of slavery and all that stuff. So I was wondering if you know about any books that particularly talk about the Orishas in Latin America and through like the development of racism and like what side they fell on and how that was handled, if that makes sense.
How the church handled it, you mean?
Yes.
So there's a couple things. All right, I'm gonna try to keep this to 5 minutes. So let me just talk about Cuba first, right? So when the Spanish-American War occurred in Cuba, which was basically when Cuba no longer was property of the Spanish realm, it became independent. The United States was intimately involved in that, and the United States took control of Cuba. During that time, there was significant movement to whiten the island. Okay? And the church was part of this whitening movement. And there were cases like the child Zoila, who was found dead, that was attributed to Afro-Cuban religious practices, and there definitely was a movement in that during that time period to suppress anything African. Okay? Then Fernando Ortiz writes his first famous book, and that further looks to suppress Afro-Cuban beliefs. Okay? At the same time, there's the evolution of Lombroso, who believed that he was a French doctor who believed that by looking at someone's skull, you could determine if they were going to be criminals. And they looked at Afro-Cubans who were in jail and got their characteristics from there. So there has been a long history of this, correct? I mean, all the way back to San Bartolomé de las Casas, who first argued originally that, that Africans didn't have the same soul, and therefore it was okay to have slavery. I mean, that was, kind of a generic kind of summary of what he said, right? It was really in defense of the indigenous, but it was in defense of the indigenous and threw the Africans under the bus kind of situation. So I'd have to go back and look through my books to see if I have something specific just on the church and the Lukumi, but nothing rings a bell at the moment. Okay? Now, I will tell you this, there's a comment, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of comment, which practitioners in Cuba will say, if it wasn't for the Catholic Church, perhaps the Orishas would not have survived, right? Because the Catholic Church provided names of saints to the mutual aid societies, provided the opportunity for days off, provided the opportunity for festivals. And nowadays, when you go to a church in Cuba, and you know what? I challenge all of you to go to the Our Lady of Charities Ermita, little church in Coconut Grove. Okay?
Only 3 of them could possibly do that because the others are online students out of town.
All right, so the 3 that are here. If I go the next time I go, I'll take the pictures and send it to you. But if you go to the Ermita, to the little church, if one of you go, take pictures for your fellow students. Okay? You will note when you get to the shrine of Our Lady of Charity, there's all these flowers that are there. You will note that 99% of the flowers are all yellow. In the world are all the flowers yellow? Why don't people bring flowers of all different colors to the Virgin? And you know why? Because yellow is the color of Oshun, who is the Afro-Cuban version of Our Lady of Charity. And the Afro-Cubans have spent so much time bringing yellow things to Oshun that it has now become the color of Our Lady of Charity also. So there is in some ways reverse syncretism. Right? There are things that are associated with Our Lady of Charity. The only reason they're associated with her is because the Afro-Cubans put yellow flowers to Oshun. You will go to church sometimes, like for a festival, and you will find that the great majority of the people in the pews are all dressed in Orisha ways. So, especially after receiving it.
Thank you for that.
It is my pleasure. Any other questions, comments? I've used up my whole hour and a half, though.
No, you haven't.
Can I say very quickly?
I got about 12 minutes, right?
Yes, you have.
Okay.
I think there is a book, and I might be wrong, or an article that is not directly about Orisha Sandria, but it is about the Catholic Church and like healthcare and medicinal medicine in relation to Lukumi. I don't know if that would pique interest, but I'm pretty sure I could send an article or something similar to that.
Yeah, that would be interesting too.
Actually, there is an article that was first written. I might have it. I've got to look for it. Sharon, remind me to see if I have it with all of my stuff that's stored. Mrs. Sandoval, who has written several books on Odisha and the Odisha community in Miami, wrote an article in the 70s about how Odisha in the exile community of Miami provided mental health support for people who had come up the island. And part of her conversation was that people, as the exiles came off of Cuba, they kind of, in a kind of Durkheimian way, felt that they were disconnected, right? They had lost their grounding, which their grounding was their society, their house, the way that they lived in Cuba, and they came here and they had lost their footing in some ways, right? And she argued that Odisha provided for many of these people some grounding, some footing, because they associated that not only with returning to Cuba, but it made them feel at home, made them feel like it was something that was part of them, and that provided some help. So that came out in the Journal of Psychology or something like that. I can look for it. That's from the 70s that she wrote that article.
You said her name was Sandoval?
Yeah. Also Mercedes Sandoval. Which, for those of you who might continue to do other types of research, in Cuba, here in Miami, or in many cities now, there are botanicas. Botanicas are religious stores that sell religious Afro, Brazilian, Cuban, Trinidadian, all these types of religious equipment, stove, anything you can think of, you go there. But the origin of that has its origin among the West Indian population in New York, who used to go to these places to buy herbs to take care of health issues. So there is a health aspect to the creation of botanica. There's a health aspect to the creation of these locations where people would go to provide for alternate medical assistance, right? That's also very typical in Nigeria. In Nigeria, I always say that I can survive anything because anytime I go to a town, they have some concoction, and I say it in the best possible ways, of roots and things, and they give you like a little shot of this, which is supposed to be good for your health and good for your heart and good for your lungs and helps with your cholesterol. I have no idea what's inside those things, all right? You just look at the bottle and it's full of a bunch of stuff, and I'm like, okay, give me my shot. Everybody else is taking their shot. I guess I'm not going to die. Boom, and I drink it, and that's that, right? But that's also very typical among in all of these communities, and it wouldn't even be just among the Orisha people, right? Herbal medicine is something that is typical among the African American community through all of the Central and South America, correct? So that does have its historical connections there.
Any other questions?
I hope you guys had fun. It's always nice.
I have it's a very basic question actually, and it's about the festivals that you said lasted for months sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So what the video you showed us, we see a crowd in the street. It looks like I don't know, like any festival, like carnival. How does that play out in real life? It's happening for months. Like, are people not working?
So it can happen for 3 weeks. Right? Because, but like these festivals also have like pieces, right? This goes on at this piece, this goes on at this piece, this goes on at that piece. So not everyone may participate in all aspects of the festivals, right? So like in the town of Ilaro, when they have the annual festival, it starts off and the Egungun people are kind of like, in charge for 3 or 4 days, and then the Gallatin people are in charge for 3 or 4 days. Then there's a few days of the Itolo people, and so it goes rotating, right? Now the Oshogo Festival is very large, and it's like at least 2 weeks long, and thousands and thousands of people go there, right? So let me say first, as a social scientist, you have to be aware of where you're at, right? You should never underestimate the safety concerns when you are not in your home country, all right? So when I was in Ilaro, I went to the IF Festival, which is down by the river, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people walking towards the river, right? It actually is, quite honestly, for those of us like myself that I grew up here in the United States, a bit overwhelming. There's just so many people going here, right? And on top of the massive amount of people, there's drums, there's people getting possessed, there's all this going on, and you have stimulus overload, quite honestly, as you're walking towards the river for the ceremony. So it's very overwhelming, and as a researcher, you have to understand where you're going to and how you're going to handle this environment that you're in. Right? I'm fortunate enough that when I'm in Ilaro, actually the Opa of Ilaro, the king of the town, and I know each other, and he sends me a guard to walk with me. Okay, which is great because I've got one of the king's guards walking with me, so that's a little bit of a hands-off situation, right? But it's extremely overwhelming. In Cuba, there's usually just 1 or 2 days, like the day of La Villa Regla and stuff like that, so it isn't bad. But in Nigeria, it gets very, very full, hundreds and hundreds of people on the street.
Okay.
So my last 2 sound bites are: no matter what your research is, enjoy it. The most important part of your research. If you can't enjoy it, you need to focus, okay, and rethink what you're doing. Like, I can stay here for hours talking about Odisha and the different countries and all that because I enjoy having this conversation with all of you. So get into it and just enjoy it, enjoy the experience. It'll make your degree so much more valuable and happy, honestly.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure. It's always my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me. Bye bye.
No, sign off, students. I don't know no, I don't think at all. How are we doing?
Good.
Everyone, I haven't looked. Everyone submitted their outline? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, one person isn't nodding, so I will check to see what happens. Okay, so next Monday, we have a presentation from Bai, an alum, who is still at SIU. She's working on her PhD in political science. And she's going to talk about her essay project, let me rephrase that. One of the papers written for her portfolio was later developed into another paper, and she won an award for it. So we asked her, I had her come into the colloquium to talk about just the process. Right? So even though 2 of you are working on proposals, I think it would be a worthwhile time to do anyway. So that's that for the rest of you. And Kevin, I'm going to talk to you about DSA. You guys hang on for a second. Right. That's it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Dr. Lucine.
Bye.